Welcome to the second lecture of week 3. We're still talking about responsibility for climate change. We've seen Senator Armstrong's argument that you as an individual, right, can't really be responsible for climate change because you can't really make a difference, right? You can't harm anyone by just emitting sort of a normal single person's amount of greenhouse gases. Um, this He offers some convincing arguments, but you may be dissatisfied with the conclusion, right? You may think that it's all of our responsibility, um, all this problem, right? If it's no one's responsibility, then this seems like potentially the hopes for fixing the problem become dimmer, right? If we have to rely on the government. I mean, Senator Armstrong does say, your job is to pressure the government to do things, but we've seen the government is pretty slow, and you may want to say it's not only good for me to, buy an electric car or try to reduce my emissions in other ways. You might want to say I have some obligation to do it. So Melanie Banks is going to formulate an account of group responsibility that does give some level of responsibility to the individuals that are a part of the group. So how individuals can be responsible for climate change. So as I said, Banks is going to offer an account of collective responsibility um, that also entails that the individuals that are part of the collective can be morally responsible for the actions of the collective, right? And in the context of climate change. So she starts by listing a bunch of the facts about climate change. I'm not going to repeat those. We've already covered them, right? But the assumptions here are climate change is real, caused by humans, and it will cause significant harm. Prima facie, we have a case. It's something that's a bad thing. We should be able to identify who's responsible, and they should have some obligation to fix it. Right. So this is the sort of you break it, you bought it principle that we tend to accept in everyday life. Right. So if I run into your car, it's my job to pay for the repairs, or I carry liability insurance. Right. I pay into it every month, and eventually, when I hit a car, the insurance company pays it out, but it's sort of my money, right, that went to pay the premiums. And in principle, this ought to apply to pollution as well. So if a chemical company pollutes a river, that very company should be the ones that pay for the cleanup. But as we've seen in Senator Armstrong's article, right, climate change is such a large-scale phenomenon that is the result of millions and billions of people's activities over the course of like centuries, it's really hard to apply you break it, you bought it in the case of climate, right? There's many different polluters. They're all contributing to this complex causal situation. We've only come to understand sort of relatively recently, maybe in the 1990s. Um, so driving to work, eating a hamburger, all that contributes, right? So do the emissions from a giant factory. But there's no real causal arrow, again, as Senator Armstrong argued fairly convincingly, to connect any single action to the problem of climate change. She uses a metaphor, right? She says, hey, look, yeah, if I lean on your car, I'm not going to damage it. But if 50 people all lean on it at the same time, then they will. But then how do you, again, find the party causally responsible for the damage, right? It's sort of distributed among a large group. So the idea is in situations like that, where it seems like it's not an individual, but a group that's responsible for harm, um, is there an analysis of group responsibility that can also, to which we can also apply the you break it, you bought it, right? The polluter pays principle. And she thinks she can. And the rest of this is basically going to be setting up her account of how that could work. We won't really consider a lot of objections. There's plenty of room for that, I think, though, if you wanted to write a paper on it. Okay, so she starts out assuming that collective responsibility is a thing, right? And we do apply it in various situations, right? It's a pretty common concept. We attribute moral blame to countries, for example, like Nazi Germany, companies, right? If ExxonMobil, right, does an oil spill and we can say, oh, bad company, you did a bad thing, right? Gangs, so on, right? Not a particularly strange concept, collective responsibility. So if we had to pick out the collective that's responsible for climate change, I guess we'd have to say it's most of the population, right? We are all contributing, emitting greenhouse gases. Um, and she's not the only person to try to sort of formulate an account of collective responsibility, um, but she thinks that the other ones uh, tend to try to sort of base it, make it similar to accounts of individual responsibility. Um, and that can work if you have a relatively small and well-structured collective. So like a company, that has a CEO and a clearly defined structure of who's responsible for what, and that sort of, you know, it makes sense to say they make collective decisions and deliberate together, right, onto what actions they should do. Um, that can be fine, right? In that sort of small situation, it can make sense to say collective responsibility is in many ways is very similar to individual responsibility. But the group that Banks is talking about is much larger and very loosely structured, right? There's not like a hierarchy or a CEO of right the world that's directing how people act with um, greenhouse gases, right? So if there's going to be collective responsibility, it's going to be it's going to have to be kind of a different account, right? Because it's a very weird collective. It's the collective of basically the whole world. But nonetheless, right, we can formulate the harms of climate change in terms of groups, right? It's not so crazy, right? There's groups of people that are harmed, right? And there's groups that are largely responsible for the harm. So we know that poorer countries are going to be disproportionately impacted by climate change. Uh, Here's a photo of like just sort of sea levels rising, right, in certain parts of the world, and certain countries are going to be less equipped to help their populations deal with that and move to safer places and things like that. Um, and we also know that richer countries are disproportionately the sources of greenhouse gases. The U.S., China, right, the more industrialized um, countries are producing the bulk of greenhouse gases, and then the bad effects are going to be kind of largely suffered by poorer countries that done as much emissions, created as many emissions. So it can make sense to talk about the harm caused to India by the United States, or different types of groups. You might say the harm caused to the poor, right? Say the poor and maybe people that don't own cars or something, caused by the rich, right? Which are people maybe who own cars. Which I know in the U.S. it doesn't seem like you have to be rich to own a car, but globally, right? That's we're most of us in the United States in global terms are fairly rich. Okay, so it seems like prima facie we can't there's room to apply a group analysis to the harms and the responsibility of climate change, and if we can sort of flesh it out and make a detailed account, right, that makes sense of it all, then that would avoid the sort of problems that Senate Armstrong points out for like pinpointing individual responsibility, right? We can say no, that the responsibility lies with a group, right? And so she sort of notes some other attempts to do this sort of thing, right? So she cites an article by Nolt, and the way he approaches the problem, um, I think it's a he. I could be wrong on that, right? So I haven't looked it up. But anyways, Nolt um, sort of calculates the average sort of emissions or whatever that a person in the U.S. will put out during their lifetime, and sort of does the math and says, yeah, that's basically equivalent to the amount of emissions that it would take to cause the suffering or death of like one or two people. Um, Certainly seems like a different sort of calculation than Senate Armstrong, right, does. There must be it must be their emissions as part of a group, and then the harms as part of a group, and he sort of averages it out. So maybe that's one approach, but what that doesn't do, right, is it doesn't sort of track any direct causal history from me, my emissions, to some particular person in the third world or whatever, right? Calculating the averages. So if we had an account of collective responsibility that can account for these causal relations of individual actions, or what sort of moral responsibility you have as part of a group that of which we can trace the causal arrow of their actions and the result. That might help us identify who is responsible, right? And picking out whose job it is to fix it is step one to fixing it. So Banks's account will be a three-stage process, right? And how we identify someone's moral responsibility as a member of a group. The three parts are this. First, you determine whether they are in fact a member of the group that is collectively responsible for the harm. So if we say, if you want to say, for example, that, okay, yeah, the United States has harmed India, right? Whatever, or rich people have harmed poor people. We've got to figure out which group you're in. And then if it turns out from that step, if you are a member of that responsible group, then we have to determine if you're a morally responsible member of that group. Not everyone in the group, right, will be morally responsible. And then third, we determine in particular what you are responsible for. So if she can make this work, seems to solve the problems that Senator Armstrong points out. Okay, so into the details of the account. Here is step one. So step one, an agent is a member of a group causing harm if and only if she participates in a collective action by, and there's three conditions, right? So the first two are disjunction, right? So you can qualify as a member of a group if you satisfy either one or two, and then also satisfy three, right? So the first way you could qualify is if you're reciprocally providing solidarity or receiving identification or public membership with the group, right? So if you're sort of publicly doing things that say, yeah, I'm on this team, I'm a part of this group. Or the other way would be just by causally contributing to the bad outcome, right? So either one of those will put you in the group, so long as you satisfy three. And three says you're not participating in some recognized activity that involves action or language that publicly distances you from and denounces the actions of the collective, right? So one and two are a disjunction, right? If you can satisfy either one, you're part of the group. And so long as you're not excused by three, then you're a member. So I think for most of us, we may satisfy one, right? We may, whatever, hang an American flag, say I'm proud to be an American. That would sort of probably qualify to make you a part of the group if we're saying the group is the U.S., right? Again, you can define the group differently. But it's almost certain that all of us, whether or not we satisfy one, are definitely going to satisfy number two by just causally contributing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, right? If you've ever driven a car, right, or purchased a product by from a company that produces greenhouse gases, you're probably right in a group that's responsible. I think almost everyone in the world by number two sort of implicated in this. So what are these excusing conditions, right? So even if you satisfy one or two, you might not be a member of the group if you do something that excuses you. So she says, excusing conditions, right? It's a action or language that somehow distances you from the group, denounces the activities of the group. So if you, she says, like one example, right? If you reduce your own emissions, obviously you can't completely get rid of them because, as we've said, breathing, right? You expel carbon dioxide. If you really cut down your emissions and you do a lot of public work, changing other people's behavior, working on legislation, whatever. Like if you're sort of devoting a chunk of your life to fighting climate change. So I have a picture of Greta Thunberg, right? Is that how you say her name? Right? Pretty young, probably, relative to like me, hasn't emitted too many greenhouse gases and sure is doing a lot of work publicly, right? Advocating to fight climate change. So if she might be excused by three, right? You might think. Okay. Okay, so that was step one. That's just determining, am I a member of the responsible group? But just because you're a member of the group doesn't necessarily mean you're a responsible member. So how do we know if you're a responsible member? You have to satisfy two conditions, a causal condition and an epistemic condition. So I think everyone knows what cause means. Epistemic just means having to do with knowledge, right? So the idea is to meet the causal condition, you have to have done something that causes emissions, right? Driven a car, something like that. Obviously, without being coerced. Right? So if somebody held a gun to your head and said you have to drive a car, that wouldn't count, right? And then the epistemic condition means you have to have known that what you were doing contributed to the harm. I think anyone in the sort of who can read or has paid any attention to the news should have known about global warming since at least 1990, right? When we had the some reports that started to say, yeah, this is real. And I should have known, right? It means that there was enough evidence out there, and you do have some responsibility to sort of seek out the evidence, right? So you can't just sit around and not watch TV and not read the news and say, sorry, I'm not responsible. I didn't know. No, as a responsible citizen, uh, you have a responsibility to find out relevant information. And sort of she uses a metaphor. She says you can't just wave a gun around and not even think about whether it's loaded. You have a responsibility to seek out certain knowledge, right? Loaded or not. Is driving a car a bad thing? So if you meet that, and I think it's fairly easy for all of us to meet that, then it sounds like you're a responsible member. So again, this she's implicating like most of the world. Something to contribute. You're a you've done something to contribute to to global warming, and you haven't been excused by sort of devoting a large chunk of your life to fighting global warming. And you knew, right? You weren't forced to do the stuff, and you knew that it was causing this problem, and you're responsible. Now, you may have already thought of this. Well, geez, this includes a really wide variety of people in here. Surely some people must be more responsible than others. And that's what step three is going to be, is like figuring out how responsible you are. Right? So some people that qualify given steps one and two as members, right, responsible members of the collective will be like presidents of countries. Some of them will be CEOs of companies that have factories that spew tons of greenhouse gases all the time. And then some people might just be people that literally have to drive a car in order to get to work and not starve, right? And if they had any other options, maybe they wouldn't emit the greenhouse gases, but there you are. Um, so all these people are responsible members of the collective. So how do we make this fair? Like, how do we spread out the responsibility in a reasonable way? So that's step three, distributing responsibility. So she carves up this large group of responsible members of the collective into three rough categories, right? And this is just a start. You might want to have more categories or something, but a beginning on this. Um, she calls the first category order givers, right? So these will be like presidents of countries, right? People who maybe members of Congress, but people who determine the rules of the game, right? The laws, the people that could outlaw emissions if they wanted to, right? Number two are order followers. So these will be sort of like the presidents of some little domain of the country. So typically like the CEO of a company or something like that, who has they have a fair amount of control over whether or not to expel a pretty good amount of greenhouse gases, right? Do I want to start a car company, right? Do I want to start a coal-fired, right, power plant, or do I want to start a recycling company, right? Like these people are deciding whether to sort of increase the amount of emissions in a big way or decrease them in a big way, right? So these are the order followers. And then number three are supporters, which are probably most of us in this classroom, right? Just a given family in North America or a citizen of a poor country that just sort of, emits sort of a normal amount of greenhouse gases and does a little more or a little less to try and to do a little of that, right? So all three of these will be responsible, but sort of in decreasing amounts. Obviously, the president has a lot of power, and they're going to be more responsible. Now, she does note, right? You might wonder if the president of the United States and the president of like a very small country, I don't know, Malaysia or something, right? Are these really in the same category? Because the president of the United States is probably the most powerful person in the world, right? Um, and Banks thinks she decides. She says, "Yeah, I understand. Like feels a little fuzzy there." She says, "I'm going to put them in group one because they do, right? The president of any country, however small, does have a lot of control over, right, how things operate in that country. But she does admit that they also are under pressure from the richer, more powerful countries to, they don't have absolute freedom in how they govern their own country because there's pressure from other countries. So maybe some of them might be more appropriately put in group two. It's not a big problem for her. But that aside, really, the point is order givers, right? They can decide the laws. They could make greenhouse emissions illegal in their country, or they could tax them very heavily, or whatever. Could be acting aggressively to reduce it, or they can be acting not at all, right? They could be encouraging it, right? And that makes them much more responsible. Um, right? Climate change is collective harm. They're responsible for steering the largest parts of the collective, so they're going to get most of the blame. Order followers, they're sort of heads of smaller collectives within a collective. Um, they have the power to affect larger amounts of emissions. Um, they decide the rules for everybody that works for them, right? They decide what kind of company they want to be. Um, and we do know the industry is responsible. I think it's what I've seen floating around the internet lately is something like 70% of emissions are from corporations, right? So they're very, very much responsible. And next is Congress people, probably the most responsible people. Um, and then, right, so you could decide what kind of company you want. You can decide whether your employees have to commute, right? They are order givers within a smaller domain. But they are, of course, working within a system that is designed by the order givers, so they do have less control, right, than the Congress. And then you've got supporters, ordinary citizens like you and me, much less responsible than those who have more power to make a bigger difference. Um, but they do have some influence, right? They do. You can, as Senator Armstrong points out, you can choose to drive a gas guzzling SUV just for pleasure, right? Um, you do have the choice to do a lot more, right? Greta Thunberg, right, is a um, just a normal citizen, right? But she is sort of devoting a great amount of her time to fighting climate change. Um, so you do have some freedom, some responsibility, right? Your contribution. So once you've done those three steps, right, now we don't have to worry about tracing your individual particular causal contributions to climate change to some particular harm, right? Which was the thing that Senator Armstrong said you can't make that causal arrow connect, right? Banks says on my account you don't need to. You don't need to make that causal arrow connect. The causal arrow is from a collective towards a collective, right? And just insofar as you're in the collective and your particular role in the collective, that's what you're responsible for, right? Um, so the collective causes the harm, and since you're a member, you have caused the harm, and you about how much of that harm you're responsible for, given your position in it. So that's it. That's her account, right? Um, I haven't sort of gone through and she didn't really present a ton of objections, I don't think, and some papers consider more than others. So this is just sort of her account without too much pushback, but that leaves a lot of opportunity for you to try and find ways to push back. It was just occurring to me as I was saying this that maybe that distinction between order givers and order followers is a little fuzzy, right? Because the government, in many ways, I think, is influenced by the powerful corporations, right? They put a lot of pressure on the government as to what laws they can and can't enact in order to get funded to do their campaigns, to get elected again, stuff like that. So there's some sort of like, uh, yeah, the ways you might argue against maybe that carves out those groups. I could see something there. Um, maybe there's other things that strike you as somewhat odd or whatever that don't feel right to you that you would want to write a paper on. Or you may want to, you might think, I like this account, but I did think of a couple problems, and so maybe I'll write a paper sort of pointing out the problems and then figuring out how maybe banks could fix her account to deal with those problems. Okay, well, I will see you in the next lecture, which will be on geoengineering.